And good morning, everybody. Welcome into this week's long-form episode here on the Mining Stock Daily podcast. I'm Trevor Hall, your host once again, and we have a long discussion with the one and only Jim Bianco of Bianco Research. Jim is really credited, at least for me, for kind of hitting on that concept of the Mar-a-Lago Accord, so it took some time to get him on. We really kind of talk about this, a little bit of what's been the latest updates over the last couple of weeks since we originally kind of popped this topic and this theme open regarding a potential new monetary regime under President Trump policy and his cabinet members as well. So there's a little bit more breadth to this conversation regarding that. We also talk a little bit about the geopolitics, European growth as far as its military as well, and just some general thoughts regarding the relationship between the U.S. and Canada. So obviously, precious metals hits a little bit of the topic here over the next hour, but it's some big conversation with Jim, so we hope you listen to it in its entirety. Special thank you to Integra Resources, Caliber Mining, and Visa Silver for their continued support of the podcast. And as always, if you wouldn't mind, hit that like, subscribe, and also share on the YouTube channel and on the podcast network you receive the feed. All right, everybody. It was a great week for precious metals equities. Let's keep the ball rolling. We'll talk to you again after this episode. We'll be back Monday morning. All right, everybody, welcome back into this week's long-form episode on Mining Stock Daily, and there is a lot to cover. A couple weeks ago, we aired a long conversation with our good friend Brent Johnson about the Mar-a-Lago Accord, and I explained how I had listened to this podcast featuring Jim Bianco about 4 times within 1 week just to try to get my head wrapped around this kind of concept of what a new monetary system might look like. Jim's been a very busy man since then, but we are very lucky to find some time with him today where we're going to talk about this and a lot of other things happening in markets and probably a little bit about geopolitics as well. He's the magician from Marquette, but today he's visiting us from outside of San Francisco. So, Jim, good to see you.
Yeah. Thanks for having me from the cabin up north here.
Yeah. Well, it's a pleasure to have you on. Listen, that concept of the Mar-a-Lago Accord was like breathtaking, and it took, like I said, it took me a while to really kind of frame it within my own mind. But I want to thank you for kind of putting all that out there and being open and connecting the dots and all that. I would like to maybe start there because that was a couple weeks ago, and obviously the news changes every 30 seconds anymore, especially from news coming out of the White House. Have there been any recent developments since you kind of approached this and put it out there over the last 2 weeks that really maybe continues to tighten the bow around that idea?
Oh, absolutely. And that is what's been happening in Europe with the payment for security. Let's talk about, first of all, so everybody knows what the Mar-a-Lago Accord is, where the name came from for starters. Every time there's been a currency realignment, they're typically named after the resort or the hotel where they were crafted. Bretton Woods is actually a resort, still is, in New Hampshire, where they crafted the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944. The Plaza Accord for the dollar was named after the Plaza Hotel in September of 1985 when they crafted that arrangement for it. So the Mar-a-Lago Accord is just a riff off of that. And of course, it's to pump up Trump's ego because he owns Mar-a-Lago. But to say that maybe what we need to do is talk about a new realignment of the global trading system. That currently the global trading system is unfair to the United States. It has resulted in a massive trade deficit, which has hollowed out a lot of our industries, industrial industries, manufacturing. And we have allowed other countries to take advantage of the U.S. This is their argument. To fix that, we need to do 2 things. We need to try and lower the value of the dollar and try to bring, imports to be more competitive with exports to have the U.S. compete on a global manufacturing basis. Now, to that end, if you listen closely to what Scott Bessent says, he seems to be saying that, because I think what happens in the market is you'll hear the Treasury Secretary, and I believe in a strong dollar, and I believe in King Dollar, or some version of that. What does that mean? That means I believe that the U.S. is the reserve currency and the strongest monetary brand in the world. But now that I've said that, I would also like the level of the dollar to go lower. But that doesn't impact its ability to be the reserve currency. They're trying to separate the two when he says, I believe in a strong dollar. But then the way Bessent says it is, now that I've said I believe in a strong dollar, I don't believe that other currencies could take advantage of the dollar, meaning I don't want the level too high. I want the level down. Mm-hmm. So that part of it seems to be happening. The dollar, according to the DXY, to use the dollar index, is down 4.5% in the first 2.5 months of this year. We've been lowering the dollar. And along those lines, in pushing this idea that the trade system is unfair, has been all this talk consuming everybody about tariffs. Tariff this, on, off, and tariffs everywhere. We can get into tariffs later, but let me finish on the Mar-a-Lago Accord. The second part of the Mar-a-Lago Accord would be debt. We have way too much debt, $36 trillion of debt. We're at the debt ceiling right now. What are we going to do about all of that debt? Now, there's a couple of things that we can do about all of that debt. One is a sovereign wealth fund. Think of it this way. That's a private sector attitude, right? If you're running a company and somebody said, our company has X amount of debt, your first question is, well, how many assets do we have? Because the debt number in and of itself is meaningless unless I have a comparator of the number of assets. And then when you say we have $36 trillion of debt, and then you look at the United States assets, you say, well, we're undervaluing the United States assets. Maybe we should create a fund and value the assets within that fund. Now, along those lines, Trump signed an executive order February 3rd to create a sovereign wealth fund. The administration is going to get back to us about, who's going to run it. Probably not Scott, but Howard Lutnick of Commerce is probably going to be like the manager of the sovereign wealth fund. And what is it going to have in it? Well, last week, from when we were recording, we got the first indication of what's going to go into the sovereign wealth fund. And that is that, roughly speaking, the Justice Department has acquired about 200,000 Bitcoin through fraud and criminal investigations. And they are going to transfer that to the sovereign wealth fund. So that'll be its first set of assets. And by the way, I'm looking forward to the day where we have this big ceremony where Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, hands Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, a thumb drive with all the Bitcoin on it, right? And stuff. Yeah. And don't lose the seed phrase.
Yes. How ceremonious.
Yes, exactly. But the other one, which might be more interesting for your audience, is the U.S. has 8,100 tons of gold, subject to the DOJ audit of Fort Knox to make sure that it's still all there. But we have $8,100 tons of gold. And it's been valued for 50 years plus at $42.22. So the other argument was revalue gold to $2,900, whatever the market value is, and that would add $900 billion to about $1 trillion of wealth, and put that in the sovereign wealth fund too. That's an open question as to what it was going to happen. But the point of the sovereign wealth fund is we're going to put all these assets. Another argument is the largest real estate owner in the United States is the federal government. Why not have a real estate management division as part of the sovereign wealth fund that manages all the real estate, so that you could envision their argument is, we got this sovereign wealth fund and it's like got more money than BlackRock, right? It's got like $15-20 trillion in it or something like that, of all these assets at market value that the United States owns. And then you say, okay, now we got $36 trillion of debt, but we got, just to throw a number in there, we got a $20 trillion sovereign wealth fund in the next several years, not right away. And it kind of offsets a little bit of that to bring down the debt. But the biggest of the three pegs is the payment for security. One of the arguments, and now I'm going to go off here, 2 weekends ago, Neil Ferguson wrote an essay in the Wall Street Journal about the Ferguson rule. And it wasn't named after him. It was named after Adam Ferguson, 17th century Scottish economist, who said that whenever a great power pays more in interest costs than defense, that country stops being a great power. Now, we, the United States, have crossed over that in 22. We are paying more in interest costs than defense. Neil Ferguson, who wrote about Adam Ferguson's rule, pointed out that over the last 200 years, that's largely been true, with the exception that there's been a few instances when the British went above on interest costs in the 18th and 19th century and then quickly went back down under it. So you hear Elon Musk, when he talks about the urgency of Doge and we have to do this, the first thing out of his mouth is we're paying more in interest costs than defense. So they look at the interest cost as being a security issue for the United States. It's not a financial issue. It's now become a national security issue. And they argue, and what was argued in Scott Mirren's paper, because this all came from Scott Mirren's paper, who's the nominee to be the Council of Economic Advisors, is that where did a lot of that $36 trillion of debt come from? It's been decades and decades of the United States being the world cop, keeping the trade lanes open, fighting communism, fighting terrorism. We have spent orders of magnitude more on defense than Europe has. And so the administration's argument is now it's time for Europe to step up and start taking on some of the burden of defense. And they have. Over the last week to two, we've had the German election. Chancellor Merz is talking about relieving the debt brake. And what that means is, since I'm talking to a largely American audience, think balanced budget amendment. That's kind of what Germany has. They're not allowed to deficit spend, but they want, because they've got a rule that they have to suspend in order to allow them to deficit spend. They want to suspend the rule so they can borrow 500 billion euros, about $550 billion, in order to beef up defense. So there's all this massive fiscal stimulus coming in the form of defense. That's why the European stocks, which have been mired in the mud forever, are starting to perk up because there's going to be some defense spending. That's why their interest rates are soaring. The German 10-year is at, I think, a 17-year high or something like that. It's the high since 2009. Because the argument here is that they're going to have to borrow massive sums of money. So that's already been happening. Where the Mar-a-Lago Accord kind of got sidetracked in a lot of the popular narrative was, one idea was, Europe, you got to pay for security. So here's an idea. You pay us, the United States, for security, but you're not going to write us a check for trillions of dollars. But we got a better idea. You have trillions of dollars of treasury securities. How about you swap them for a zero coupon 100-year bond? Why would Europe do it? It's payment for security is what it is. And so everybody thought the Mar-a-Lago Accord was the debt swap and only the debt swap. No, that's just you owe me money. Now we're arguing whether or not it's going to be a paper check or Zelle. That's all that debt swap was meant to be. It was meant to be a form of payment, not that was the plan. And what Europe is saying, we agree we need to pay you. We're going to do it by spending gobs and gobs of money on defense over the next decade, presumably so the U.S. doesn't have to. Presumably then the U.S. could start, not in the current budget, but in future budgets, reducing its defense spending because, for instance, 60,000 U.S. troops are stationed in Europe. Maybe we could go to 40 or 30,000. We can have the budget that we spend in putting troops in Europe because there will be a European Federated Army that will take on that role for the U.S. So that's what the Mar-a-Lago Accord is. What is it designed to do? Lower the value of the dollar, bring us more competitive on trade, relieve us of this extreme debt situation because we've violated the Ferguson rule and we can't go on with this being the same way that it's been. So we've redefined the debt situation as not a problem for the Treasury Secretary, but a problem for the National Defense, for the Defense Secretary and the intelligence community. Your major problem now is our debt problem, the defense and intelligence community, because that is a problem for defense and intelligence. And so that's why it's taken on that kind of urgency.
Okay. Incredible walkthrough. And obviously we're going to start breaking that up, but and we could take this many directions, but maybe just talk about the European aspect on this with increased military spending. When this was announced, Jim, my first questions was where the hell are they going to find the money to increase their military spend? Their economies are just stuck in the mud. They have no money. So how does that shape up? And if they are going to bulk up a European unified military, I mean, is that the vision, to have one big European military? We've seen this before in a previous cycle leading up to World War One and the Great War, where
Yeah.
there was the Austro-Hungarian problem where they had one army, but they spoke 4 different languages, and so communication was quite terrible. So this has been seen before. But I guess, go back to like, how do they afford to boost their military spend?
Well, this is a really good question. And I might also, when answering that, I'll throw in a side question. What is the definition of military spending? Because, you or people listening to us might think, aircraft carriers and tanks and fighters, but it might be more than that, in terms of military spending. First of all, it's not clear what they mean. I think what they ideally want is a European federated army, right? All of the European armies would pull in together as one. But that's even becoming questionable because the Poles have said that they're all in on spending more on military spending, and they have said, we would like to have an army of 500,000, a Polish army of 500,000, not part of a European federated army, and we would like nuclear weapons in Poland to protect ourselves against Russia because we share a border with Russia. Now, the problem is when you're part of the European Union, well, the French have nuclear weapons and and a bunch of others in Europe have nuclear weapons. And the Poles are saying, what, you can have them, but we can't, and we're still part of the same union. That gets a very bit sticky. The Poles want to have an army, and then how is Russia going to view a NATO army of 500,000 on their border? That gets very, very sticky. And so it's unclear what they mean by army, and stuff. They say the platitudes of a European federated army, but there's no detail on it. And that is a sop to World War I and World War II. We don't want a German army again. We've had German armies before in the last 100 years, and both of them times didn't end well. We want it to be part of some kind of federated army. The other problem you have when it comes to military spending is, what are you doing with military? What is the goal of military spending? To protect us. To protect us from what? Let's say Russia. Well, it's been pointed out that Europe has been dependent on Russian cheap natural gas for many years. Europe, it's been pointed out that in 2024, if you looked up all of the aid that Europe sent to the Ukraine to fight Russia, it was less than they spent buying Russian crude oil. So wait a minute, you're buying crude oil from Russia and then you're sending money to the Ukraine to fight Russia. How does this work? So there's another argument that has been made that the Europe needs to not only protect themselves from Russia by beefing up their army, but economically they need to cut their tie with Russia. So they need to find alternative energy sources. Well, where are they going to find an alternative energy source? A big one is nuclear. Well, there's a big difference. What's happened let's take a look at Germany, right? It's a third of the European economy. Germany's in April of 2023 closed its last nuclear power plant. At that time, Germany was producing electricity at 30% less the price that France was producing it. And France does like 70 or 80% of their electricity via nuclear. Since 2023, we've had the Ukraine war. Russia has cut off the gas supplies to Europe. It's down 90%. Nord Stream, the big oil pipeline gas pipeline, was blown up. We don't know by who, but it doesn't work. And now in Europe, Germany in particular, by cutting down nuclear, has been using natural gas to make electricity. They've gone from a 30% discount to France to a 20% premium in 2 years. And so that has really retarded their economy. Keep in mind, Germany is the massive industrial economy, industrial base, that's the word I was looking for, industrial base of Europe. What do you need to be a successful industrial base? Just like in mining, you need cheap energy. Germany no longer has cheap energy. Well, there is a way to get cheap energy back in Germany. Restart your nuclear power plants. But the problem there is the Europeans have a strong green and progressive movement within their parliaments. Restarting your nuclear power plants is easy to say and politically extraordinarily difficult to do. So you're just going to buy some guns and some aircraft carriers and call that security, and then be dependent on getting gas and crude oil from Russia that they could kind of shut the spigots off anytime they want to shake your chain? Or you're going to break from that. And if you break from that and you still need cheap energy, you're not going to get it from the United States or Saudi Arabia. There's a cheap way to do it. France does it. It's called nuclear. But you've got these massive green parties that want to do away with nuclear. So this is I tried to lay this out because it's easy to say we're going to spend more on defense. What I'm trying to argue is I have no idea what that means. And I don't think the Europeans have no idea what it means. But the Europeans are ready to throw money at everything. That's why their bond yields are going up. Where are they going to get the money? They're going to borrow it. And they're going to have to pay higher interest rates. That's why their bond yields are going up. Why are their stock markets going up? Because a lot of their industrial and basic industries are saying, man, they're going to start buying stuff from us. The governments are going to start, there's going to be activity here where we've been kind of just stuck in this overregulated mess called Europe, that maybe this is going to start to change.
Yeah. I remember watching the Vice President J.D. Vance speech at the Munich Security Conference and just really taking a seat back in my chair thinking, wow, this is a moment in time where it seems like things were really going to change as far as the geopolitical relationship between the U.S. and Europe. And I think that will continue to be an important moment in history as this continues to progress. Also been reading a great book.
Can I come on that real quick? I
Yeah.
agree with you that speech was really important. And let me give you my interpretation of that speech. For 60, 70 years, the U.S. has spent 5, 6, 7% of its GDP on defense. Europe has spent 1 or 2. For 60 or 70 years, we have kept the security umbrella over Europe. So you've been allowed for the last couple of generations to use your money on national health care, on progressive movements, on becoming more green. We've never had that luxury because we've had to build aircraft carriers and fighter jets and keep the world safe. Because of that, over the last 60 or 70 years, your priorities and our priorities have started to kind of diverge. And now we're starting to say to you that they've diverged to the point where if you want security, you got to do it yourself. And this is a tectonic movement, not all of it, but a good part of it, because our interest payment is over our defense budget. The United States, cannot afford it anymore. And that's what I think he was trying to say in Munich was this is a realignment, is what we're talking about. This is not just a new spending bill. This is a complete realignment of the European-United States relationship that we're going through right now. And so, yes, I agree with you. It is a very big deal, what that speech was implying.
Yeah. And it will be interesting to see, how this European military infrastructure is put in place. And the reason I wrote, and let me kind of preface this, Jim, and get your thoughts here. The reason Germany was able to, at one point, have cheap energy was because of the relationship between Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder and his relationship with Vladimir Putin in the early 2000s. Turns out after he was done taking Chancellor, he was given a directorship at Nord Stream, of all things. So obviously that relationship was fortuitous for Mr. Schroeder throughout his career. Now that has come to an end. And if you look at the military applications in Ukraine in the last couple of years, obviously there are, soldiers with guns on the front lines. There's tanks and missiles and all these things, but there's also a far advanced technological aspect using drones, computer, developers, computer programming, and all those things, which are at, a fraction of the cost that it is to build, aircraft carriers. And so, it's just kind of interesting. I don't know if there's a question in there, but it will be interesting to see how Europe kind of takes those two aspects, the big industrial part of building defense and the military compared to the technological aspect and advanced military that we are seeing in Ukraine will obviously be a big part of military activities as we progress as societies. But also Europe really doesn't have a huge technology industry. It doesn't have a Silicon Valley, right?
Right. It doesn't. So a couple of thoughts there for you. On the military aspect, you're 100% correct. I was at an investment conference in Florida back in January, and General Walsh, who runs Top Gun, was one of the speakers. And he talked about, airplanes and military spending and, pilots and all this other stuff. And I raised my hand and I said, do we really still need pilots? Let me give you an example. The Red Sea. The Houthis are building these drones, which are literally being powered by lawnmower engines and duct tape. They cost $50,000. They pack a few hundred pounds of explosives on them, and they fly them out sort of towards the ships out into the Red Sea. They cost them $50,000 to build these things. We shoot them down with a $10 million missile. The Houthis are happy to play that game until the end of time. We will run out of $10 million missiles before they run out of duct tape and lawnmower engines, is basically what the argument is. And I've said to them, isn't the new military now that we don't need a $10 million missile being launched from a $200 million plane, but you need to find a way for $1,000 to shoot down that drone. You need to find cheap ways to do this stuff so that it costs practically nothing. Then we could play that game with the Houthis all day long. You'll run out of lawnmower engines before we run out of $1,000 ways to shoot down your drones. Yeah. And he largely dismissed the idea. No, we still need $200 million planes. No, we still need all of these other big toys that militaries like to have. And we need these big multi-billion dollar aircraft carriers for projection of power and the like. I understand the projection of power argument. But the new military is, how do I do it cheaper? Not how do I find a nice, sophisticated system to do this stuff? And I think that that's really an argument within the Pentagon, which is now undergoing. I don't think Europe gets it at all. I think Europe wants to buy big, expensive toys. And they think that these big, expensive toys are going to deter, the threats that they have. Because they've got two threats. They've got the threat from maybe Russia and the axis that they have with Iran and North Korea and China, but they also have a threat from terrorism. And if you've got suicide bombers that are going to blow yourself up, you're not going to fix that with billion-dollar toys. So there is this other kind of rethink about what is a modern military supposed to do at the same time. And it's a very complicated set of questions. And it seems from my perspective that Europe is just ready to buy some guns, buy some tanks, buy some big toys so that we've got all this stuff. But I don't know if that's going to do you any good. We had multi-billion-dollar, guided missile destroyers in the Red Sea. And I hate to say this for my friends in the military, but effectively we lost the war with the Houthis because they could send $50,000 drones all day long at a guided missile destroyer until it ran out of $10 million missiles. And then it had to leave. And then they controlled the Red Sea. That's the new war we're fighting right now. And I just don't know how many people in the military really understand that.
Yeah. I think if this were to be the case, if they do begin to adopt technology within the military, they will miss the United Kingdom within those parameters because the UK has a lot more, kind of startup technological, build to fail type of mentality that it just will not. It's not in Europe.
So another good point about that, when you say it's not in Europe, Mario Draghi, who used to be the head of the ECB and was the president of Italy for a little while, wrote a report on competitiveness about how the old line is, the U.S. innovates and Europe regulates, and that Europe has to get rid of that mentality. And he had a very telling statement, either in the report or in one of the op-eds he wrote about the report. Elon Musk is South African. Now, like him or hate him because of his politics, the guy has done extraordinary things between Tesla, SpaceX. He was a founder of PayPal. He runs Twitter. He was an OpenAI founder as well, too, although he had a falling out with Sam Altman. Anybody that could do one of those is extraordinary. He's done all of those. And his point was about Elon Musk. And this was written before the election and before he became, the lightning rod that Doge is. Would Europe love the next Elon Musk, who's growing up somewhere like South Africa, to say, I want to send rockets to Mars and I want to build transformational cars, and I think I need to move to Paris or to Madrid or to Berlin to do this? No, it never occurred to Elon Musk or the future Elon Musk that I have to move to Paris or Berlin to do this. I have to move to Mountain View, California or Austin, Texas. So Europe has got to figure out, how do you get that next transformational entrepreneur to want to say, I want to live in Paris because I can do this in Paris? That's a big ask for Europe to try and reorient themselves, to say to the Elon Musks or to say to the people in Silicon Valley, there's a burgeoning community here in Paris for you. There isn't one right now for them. Right. And that's going to be hard for Europe to develop that.
Absolutely. Let's kind of maybe get back on track about economies here. And obviously we've covered a lot of the Mar-a-Lago Accord. You did mention, a while ago about the tariffs. Those headlines about tariffs continue to change. Seems like every hour. Yes. Big stream financial media, especially what's interesting here is like the tariff headlines have really navigated from something Trump had proposed and that we needed to do to kind of get in line with the Chinese and kind of those trade negotiations, but it has quickly turned into everything about the U.S. Canadian trade relations. And it's done so really quickly, and to the point where a lot of people are calling this a trade war, and people are starting to kind of find those old Ronald Reagan speeches about trade wars and those economies and how those things work. And I'm seeing those pop up in the last 12 hours a lot. I guess my question for you here, Jim, is this a trade war? And is this kind of spiraling out of control, specifically with relationships between U.S. and Canada?
The U.S. and Canada relationship has been really complicated. I thought that what Trump did was it started off as a troll about he didn't like Trudeau, and he kept trolling him by calling him the governor of Canada and stuff. All right, I get that. And I think that initially most Canadians, I would guess, got that too. Trump doesn't like the guy and he's making fun of him. Okay, whatever, fine, move on. But then it kind of got more and more into this whole 51st state thing. It's unclear to me what it is that he really wants from Canada. That, he keeps threatening them with tariffs because he wants this flow of fentanyl and he wants the flow of illegal migrants from Canada to stop. All right, I get their argument that maybe the flow of fentanyl is not zero and the flow of illegal migrants is not zero, but it's really not significant. The flow of fentanyl and migrants is from Mexico. So when you start hammering Mexico with that stuff, it makes more sense why you're doing it on Mexico, because there's a real problem on that border there. So I don't get where he was going with this. Canada also has another issue in that a lot of the premiers of the provinces are very, very strong. So Doug Ford, announces 25% tariffs on Ontario hydroelectric generation down to the U.S. And what happened the day before we were recording was Trump said, look, you're going to put 25% tariffs on electricity going to Minnesota and New York and everything else. I'm going to put 50% tariffs on your steel and aluminum coming up there. And within an hour or two, Ontario dropped the 25% tariff and Trump dropped half at least of the 50% tariff that he was suggesting that he was going to put on steel and aluminum. And we'll see what happens with the other half. But to Canada, I don't understand what are we mad about with Canada, right? What is Trump upset about with Canada? Now, some have argued that because of global warming, there's a new trade route that's opening north of Canada through the Arctic. And that trade route, or there's a shipping lane that's opening through the Arctic that can be a potential trade route, which is shorter distance from Asia to Europe by going through the Arctic than we currently do right now, going around the Cape of Good Hope or through the Suez Canal, but we can't because of the Houthis in the Red Sea. And so that is opened up. But the problem there is that apparently, as I understand it, it is being dominated by warships from Russia and China. So somebody's going to have to go up there and make sure that there's no monkey business, and that's going to fall to the U.S. Navy. Trump wants the Canadian Navy to do it, but the Canadian Navy is not equipped to do it. And so Trump is saying, well, hell, if we're going to have to do it, you're going to have to pay, and the way you're going to pay is we're going to make you the 51st state, kind of similar to the argument that he's using with Greenland. I don't understand where this argument is going, and it seems to be backfiring with Trump to the extent that before all this started, it looked like Poilievre was just going to walk right into the premiership whenever they have the next election before October, if not earlier. But now, with the wave of patriotism we're seeing in Canada, Carney might actually win this election. Which was 30 or 60 days ago was inconceivable, but now it is conceivable that this may happen.
Well, it's very similar to the U.S. election, Jim. Remember when Kamala stepped in and all of a sudden Trump wasn't a shoo-in for about 4 weeks? Yes,
until they kind of reassessed where Kamala was. And I think that, the way that will happen is Poilievre will just have to come out and say that he's dead set against the 51st state, and, and he's going to push back on some of this stuff that Trump is doing. And I think then, to wave the maple leaf and, single Canada doesn't necessarily mean that you have to vote Carney. You could also vote Poilievre if you want to do the same thing too.
Yeah. What an interesting turn of events there in Canada.
Right.
Obviously, we work a lot with Canadians and a lot of friends up there. And it has been wild to listen to some of those conversations about what's been happening.
And I'll go back to what I said earlier. I mean, I understand what Trump is saying when he threatens tariffs on Mexico, because Mexico is probably taking more advantage of the situation with the U.S. than anybody else. Not only do they take advantage of the situation that we've got this illegal migrant flow, which is now stopped because they've shut off the border. We've had this fentanyl flow, which he wants to stop, and he wants them to crack down on the cartels, which have always been a problem. But Mexico is the largest trading partner with the United States, the largest. Why Mexico? Because a lot of Chinese companies ship parts into Mexico. Then they assemble a computer or a car in Mexico, and then it falls under USMCA, no tariff, right up into the United States. So it's been a way for China to circumvent the tariffs that we keep slapping on them by send all the stuff to Mexico, have some Mexicans put it together, and then ship it up to the United States, no tariff. Well, that's getting cracked down on. That was not supposed to be the case under USMCA, and it kind of is, and it's not allowed. But the Mexicans allowed it. Prior to Trump, nobody really called them on it, but he's calling them on it now. So my point is, I understand this hard line with Mexico because there's a lot of issues there. But to say we're going to do the same thing to Canada is a head scratcher. I don't know. You want the Canadians to build a navy to take care of the shipping lanes in north of Canada? Then help them build a military navy to do it. You don't need to make another star on the flag in order to solve that problem. I don't understand where he's going with this.
And there will be consequences. Obviously, the steel and aluminum is one thing. The lumber is a massive issue that I think is going to have consequences just because there's huge producers of lumber. We just don't have the trees that Canada has, right? So this is it is going to be a big issue. But this also comes back to really the grander question of markets in the last couple weeks and this correction we've been in, and a lot have been attributed to the uncertainty coming out of Washington in the relationships between Canada and Europe and Ukraine. And I mean, markets hate uncertainty, and so you can see this kind of this sell-off and the sell-off in stocks, a sell-off in the dollar. A lot of countries who had put their capital into the U.S. stock market because that was the best place to put it, potentially beginning to repatriate some of that capital. That's, really pushing the market even lower. We are getting a little bit of a correction after the CPI print here. But there's these I guess maybe it's a conspiracy theory. I don't know. Maybe there's sound reason for it just because of the cost of the interest of the federal debt. But people are starting to say, oh, President Trump, he wants the market to go down so he can kind of work towards some of the concepts in the Mar-a-Lago Accord. Do you think there's any clout to this, Jim?
No, I don't think there's clout to the idea that he wants the market to go down. I think he's looking at a page from the Reagan first term. Not that there's going to be a third term of Trump, but that in the first term of Reagan, he cut taxes. And then it blew out the deficit. And then we had a recession. And everybody hated Reagan by the end of 81 and into 82. And his approval rating was down, in the 40s. And then the recession ended. The markets turned, we famously all know in August of 82 was the big major bottom in the stock market, and they started to turn. And by 83 and 84, as the Reagan re-election campaign said, it was morning in America. And everybody forgot how mad they were at him in 81 and 82 because things started to get better. So Trump is trying to say, look, what we're doing is disruptive. What we're doing is going to require a detox, as Scott Bessent called it. So let's do it now. Then they'll get mad at us now, and they will be upset about it now. Maybe the markets won't like it for a while. And that's why we'll tell everybody we're focused on the 10-year note. We're not focused on the S&P. But the hope is by 26, especially late 26, when we come up to the midterm elections, we'll turn the corner. Things have gotten better. And we'll start to see that this was all worth it. Now, this was all worth it. What does that mean? I've been very blunt with people, and I've said, look, do you think $36 trillion of debt is a problem? And everybody says yes. Do you think that the Adam Ferguson ratio, that we're spending more on interest cost than defense, is a worrisome sign? Yes. Do you think that the government intrusion in terms of regulation and everything is too much? Yes. Did we have a crisis? Well, Chairman Powell said in December that the current fiscal path of the United States was unsustainable and called for a change. So I think what's driving the administration, Trump, Mirren, Bessent, Lutnick, and the people that voted for him, is if we did nothing, if we did the status quo, which is what the Economist magazine, the current edition of the Economist magazine, has a picture of Trump with a can of gasoline and a lit dollar bill, and he's about to torch the world. And their argument is, for God's sake, Donald, just stop. His argument would be, you want me to go back to where we were with a $2 trillion deficit and a $7 trillion budget, and we're just going to borrow into infinity to just keep going like this? We will blow up if we go back to the status quo. We cannot go back to the way we used to do things. This is a crisis. We have to change. The Mar-a-Lago Accord and everything else is part of that change. And this will be disruptive, but we have no choice. Because if your argument is stop with the tariffs, stop with this, go back to $2 trillion deficits, go back to $7 trillion budgets, hello, 7% 10-year note is basically what you're going to have. So we can't go back. We have to go forward. Now, you're asking, I'm paraphrasing what Trump would argue if he was rational. You're asking, well, is there a way we could do this without us noticing it? And you wouldn't call me on a podcast to talk about it. It would just fix itself in the background and never. No, something has to give in order to make this change. And that's why he's saying, get it started now. You won't like it now. I don't want the stock market to go down, but if it has to, I'll tolerate it. And I want to keep interest rates low. He's a real estate guy. He wants interest rates low. And we need to fix this amount of debt and deficit and all of these other problems that we have. And hopefully by the end of 26, you'll see that we've kind of realigned everything. Europe is going to pay more defense, so we could pay less. We'll get the value of the dollar down, but it'll still be the reserve currency, so we could become more competitive on the trade side. That's what I think they're trying to do right now. But I think what you got to ask yourself, the question is, it's disruptive. Yeah, he's a transactional guy, on and off and stuff like that. I get that. He's not very ideological. And so because he's transactional, it is always going to be kind of herky-jerky. But the argument is, what is the alternative? If the alternative is go back to a Biden $7 trillion debt budget and a $2 trillion deficit, we blow up if we go and do that. That's what they believe.
Do you think the issue with all this, I mean, there's a couple of concerns, I guess. We could talk about how it's being done as being a concern, but I actually think if you kind of take a step back, and there's almost this replication between what Trump and the administration is trying to do with what Javier Milei in Argentina has done in the last year. But there's drastic differences between Argentina a year ago and the U.S. 2 months ago here. Obviously there's a little bit of showmanship, but Javier Milei, I mean, when he was campaigning, really set this up and explained why, if he was elected, why this type of work needed to be done. It was almost like this. Yes, there was some grand posturing, but there was also some education behind it, to the point where people, when they voted for him, knew exactly what he was going to do, and they supported him. Where when Trump was campaigning, it was, I'm not the Democrats, I'm not Kamala. Some of this has to change, but how he was going to do some of these, these cuts, like he swings from the hip all the time, and that was not transparent. And which comes to the issue is like maybe people are on the fence about not liking how it's being done. Is that something would it be better if he came out and said, listen, this is where we're going to go. This is why we're in trouble. This is how we're going to get there.
I agree with you. And I agree with you on both ends. I think that in general, if you ask me, who are the most influential world leaders today, other than the obvious answers of the head of Russia, the head of the United States, whoever they always are at the top of the list. But if you were to pull somebody from the mid-tier or low-tier and say they've got enormous influence, it's Milei. It's Milei. That people around the world are really looking at him as having the influence of almost another G8 type of leader for the moment, because of the remarkable turnaround that he has pulled off. Now, to your other question about explain this, this gets back to he's transactional. He's not ideological. If you asked me, and maybe this has gone around in the White House, I would have said, you want to start with tariffs? You want to give an easy sell to tariffs? Reciprocal tariffs are easy to sell. And reciprocal tariffs sound fair. Europe, you charge 10% tariffs on American cars going into Europe. We charge 2% tariffs on European cars coming into the United States. We're going to 10, same as you. You don't like 10, we can negotiate all of them down to 2, or 0 if you want to go to his free trade. That would have been easy to sell. That would have been easy to argue. But it's this on-off, using tariffs as a transactional punishment tool to get what you want is where he started. And he started with Mexico, and he started with Canada. And I understand why he started with Mexico and Canada, because they're our two biggest trading partners as well. I don't understand this whole going to the other side of that. We have to start, talking about the 51st state and having, guys beat the crap out of each other in the U.S. Canadian hockey game and all of that other stuff. But, I don't understand that part. But I do understand why he started with Mexico in Canada. But you're right. What you're arguing is he needs to ideologically lay out where he wants to go. But Trump is not an ideological guy. He's a transactional guy. If you want to talk about him being a transactional guy, one of my favorite lines from Trump 1.0 was some reporter once quipped to Melania, would you have married Trump if he wasn't rich? And she fired back at the reporter, would he have married me if I wasn't beautiful? So, he's a transactional guy. What can I tell you?
Yeah, pretty witty. I was in Argentina a couple of weeks ago, and I will say I asked a lot of people about the thoughts on Milei, and it was always approval. Like, some of it was maybe lost in translation because I don't know Spanish very well, but it was, everybody I talked to was approving. If you talk to people here in this country about the last 6 weeks under Trump, a lot of people, even if they voted for Trump, they say there's a slight difference. There's like, yes, we like what he's doing, but there's this but maybe we don't like how it's being done, or something else. In Argentina, there was never a but. Again, it could have been lost in translation, but there is a very slight difference there.
I'll push back on that. If you would have gone back to Argentina a year ago, there was a but. But since the programs are starting to look like they work, that but has disappeared. What people are arguing, I'm not a spokesman for the Trump administration, and I have my problems with them. But I do also think that to just try to say that they're half uncocked, not thinking this stuff's through, is also a mischaracterization. What they would argue to you is what I said earlier. Look, we're at a crisis. We can't continue with $36 trillion of debt and $1 trillion plus of interest costs. We cannot continue with a $2 trillion deficit. We cannot continue with what they would refer to as the deep state over-regulating and strangling businesses. And, a great example of that would be what the SEC has done to crypto over the last 4 years. That cannot stay as a status quo. We have to move forward with different things. And to move forward with different things is going to be unsettling. We're going to have to break some things. It just is. Like I said earlier, if there was a way to say, please fix the debt and please fix the regulatory state, and please do it so that the S&P quietly keeps going up 15% a year and interest rates stay low and my team wins the World Series. And, and I get everything, without any problems. That's not going to happen. So in order to realign the system, it's going to be jarring. And that's where Elon comes in and says, look, the only way you fix broken organizations, you got to fire everybody. You got to change the culture. And that's what they're doing. Now, you could argue the government is different than the private sector. All right, I get that. But that's what they're trying to do. So the but is because all we're seeing is the chaos. In a year or 18 months, if we see the positive results of it, everybody will forget the but. Now, let me make a quick comment on. I said, I'm in San Francisco, in a coach house, in a cottage coach house here, and that's where all the bunk beds are behind me. Yesterday, I was down visiting clients in the Silicon Valley area, about 50 miles south of where I'm at right now, and I mentioned to them that I would argue, and if you didn't get the tone of what I'm saying, I think conceptually, I don't disagree with what Trump is trying to do. Conceptually, we can't go back to the status quo. Conceptually, we got to change. But Silicon Valley is full of guys, thousands of people with good ideas that could not execute on those ideas, and they never saw the light of day. The problem with Trump is you could argue, like I'm arguing, we can't go back to status quo. Conceptually, he's got the right idea, but he could completely botch the execution of this and wind up making it worse. That is true. That is a risk. But don't confuse that with just stop doing this altogether. Okay, well, then what's your plan? Your plan can't be $2 trillion deficits and $7 trillion budget. What are we going to do if you don't like this? An incremental approach, that's the status quo. Don't fire everybody, that's the status quo. So they start with this idea that we have to change. And I understand where he's going with this as a transactional guy. I hope, like everybody else, they don't botch the execution on this. Like I said, there's lots of people with lots of great ideas in Silicon Valley, and there's been feces that say, good, here's a check. I think this is a great idea. And they can't execute on it, and it winds up being nothing. And that's what we have to be careful of. Is he going to execute on it? Milei executed. He executed after a year to 18 months. So that but was probably there a year ago. It's not there right now. We got the but here in the United States. But if he can execute on this and we start to see the unshackling of private sector businesses and they start moving forward, because they're not being strangled by regulation and the like, well, that but will go away. And by the way, last word on that. 3 million businesses in the United States. Only a couple of thousand of them are listed companies. I'm a business. You're a business. The vast majority, not the vast majority, but according to the ADP report, something like 30% of the American public works for a company of less than 20 employees. I'm a company of less than 20 employees. You might be as well, too. Something like 45% of the workforce works for a company of less than 50 employees. That's who's being strangled by the regulation. That's who needs the relief. Not that we need to give more relief to General Motors and Tesla and GE so that their stock prices could go up. It's to give the relief to a company like me. If I can even hire one or two more people, that's like adding a third to my workforce. And if I could get that kind of relief, if you could get that kind of relief, that's what brings the economy forward. Because, as I said, most of us I think the majority of people in the United States work for a company of less than 100 employees, if not less than 250 employees. We don't work for companies of several thousand employees. Companies with several thousand employees are listed on the New York Stock Exchange. The rest of them are private companies that employ half of the country, and that's who needs the regulatory relief.
Last question here, Jim. We just have a couple of minutes left. But recessions get political pretty quickly. Obviously, Milei has put Argentina in a recession for a purpose. He has midterm elections coming up this fall. We'll see how the public, respond to this come, I think it's October. Let's focus on the U.S. Is because of these decisions, these policies, is the U.S. heading into a recession? We are seeing kind of lagging growth and a lot of numbers being adjusted with GDP. How quickly does a recession in the U.S. get political? And is that something that we'll most likely see as far as public response in next year's midterms?
A recession gets intensely political, and even just the threat of a recession gets intensely political. Right. I mean, so that is. But let's talk about what a recession is real quick. The natural state for capitalist economy in the United States is to grow. 90% of the years since World War II has been positive growth. What is a recession? A recession is what Rudy Dornbush, who was an economist in the 1970s, had a famous line. He said, economic expansions don't die of old age, they're murdered. So what I like to joke, and I'm not being disparaging, the last person to ask if we're in a recession is an economist, because they're the most unqualified people to tell you if we're in a recession. Why? Because a recession is not dig deeper in the payroll report, dig deeper in the retail sales report, and you will see the weakness that will come that is the burgeoning of a recession. Economic expansions do not die of old age. That's looking deeper in the report to see if it's got sclerosis because it's old. They die because a murder has been occurred. The last murder was COVID. That murdered the economy. 9/11 murdered the economy. The Arab oil embargo murdered the economy. The housing crash murdered the economy. The Great Recession, the financial crisis. So the question is, are tariffs and all this tariff chaos murdering the economy? That's the real question. And you're not going to see it in the report. Let me boil down the question even further. Are people looking at the tariff chaos? And are they saying, we had a plan to expand our business for the next 2 years, so let's put it on hold. My wife and I had a plan to buy a bigger house. Let's not buy a bigger house. Is that happening? I'm going to say no, it's not happening. Why? Because all this stuff is transactional. And at the end of the day, as I said earlier, there's only been one set of lasting tariffs since Trump came that has taken place, and that's 10% on cheap Chinese goods, and no one talks about that. All the histrionics about tariffs between Europe, Canada, and Mexico are on, off, and none of them have had any staying power. So I don't think anybody's changing their behavior yet. No one is going to call off a 2-year plan to expand their business because Trump threatened some tariffs. Ontario backed off on the 25% on electricity. He called off the tariff. That's it. We're not going to expand our business. No, they're going to expand their business if he puts the tariffs on and they have what looks like some lasting power. And we'll have to see whether or not that happens. So no, I don't think we're having a recession. I understand that this on-off uncertainty is unsettling. It's unsettling to me too. But I don't think it's going to have that lasting fear. Now, you come back to me in a month, a week, 6 months, and you say, no, look, he slept on these tariffs. They're not going away. They're affecting the long-term trade balances between the countries. Now people are starting to call off long-term plans. Then we could talk about a recession. Last thought for you. 2 years ago this week, Silicon Valley Bank failed. That was the last time I thought that economic recessions are murdered, was the Silicon Valley murder. The week Silicon Valley Bank failed, the 10-year Treasury in the United States fell 60 basis points in 1 week because we were going to go into recession. We were going to have a financial crisis. Then Signature Bank failed. Then Republic Bank failed. And eventually Credit Suisse failed, was swallowed up by UBS, all within a couple of days of each other. The 60 basis points down, we were having the exact same argument we're having now. We're going to have a recession. It's driven by a financial crisis. Churned sideways for a few months. The stock market sold off 8% during that period, churned sideways for a few months. There wasn't going to be a recession. Everything took off straight north in the second half of the year. Both interest rates and the stock market. The 10-year yield eventually went back to 5% by October of 23. So I think that we've seen this before. It's the right idea. Are these tariffs going to be the murder weapon for the economy? Only if they're lasting. If he's using them as leverage to get something else. I'm threatening tariffs on Mexico. They put 10,000 troops on the border and they're going to try and crack down on the cartels to slow the flow of fentanyl. Okay, they're gone for a month. He said he's going to put 50% tariffs on Canada, but then Ontario pulls back on the 25% on electricity. Okay, they're half. If he does that, no recession. But if he actually follows through for an extended period of time with these tariffs, then we could talk about recession.
Well, you'll be the first phone call here in the next couple of months if we need an update, Jim. Thorough conversation. We took up all the hour. I will go back about 10 minutes ago. You mentioned when all things are good and your team wins the World Series. You got your one in your century, so I hope you enjoyed it.
Yes. Yeah, not only did we get our one in a century, but being a Chicagoan, I also suffered through the White Sox last year, which had the worst record in the 100-year, 50-year history of baseball. They lost 121 games. No team has ever done that. So there we go.
That's
We're
right.
back to normal in Chicago.
But, a lot of good things came out of the White Sox. In fact, that's where I met my wife. I met my wife at a White Sox game.
And that's good. Finally,
that's
something positive. Something
right.
Positive on the south side of Chicago. Congratulations on that.
All right. Jim Bianco from Bianco Research. Always a pleasure. A lot to take away, a lot to consider. I am going to take you up on that. Let's touch base here in the next couple of months, Jim, and see how this is all playing out. Safe travels to you. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.